Top of the morning. How are you? It's Easter, you know. You know what that means? It means that. You know what else it means? What? Oh yeah, candy. Yeah. You know what else it means? This is like, shut up, just tell us what you're trying to get at. It means that you've been successful in arriving at the next major holiday after Christmas. Unless you consider Valentine's Day a major holiday and that makes you single. Or if you consider St. Patrick's Day a holiday and that makes you from Butte. So, either one. I was actually thinking this week about, we'll get to the coat, by the way. I know some of you are like, dude, where's my church? Like, where is my church? Like, this place has gotten stuffy since I was here last time. We'll get there, just trust me. But I was thinking this week about the similarities between Christmas and Easter, and I know that there doesn't appear to be a lot of them, particularly the way that we celebrate them culturally, and yet, obviously, those of us that follow Christ, there's a lot of similarities in that Jesus was born and he died. But I was thinking about just how both of those holidays have this incredible way of luring us into the temptation of portraying ourselves as perfect, right? If only for a spell. Like both Christmas and Easter have this remarkable ability to get us to take the bait that we're supposed to be perfect. Or worse, and even more unlikely, that our family is supposed to be perfect. Or that it is, in fact, perfect. Are you with me? I feel it with regards to Easter every year, and I think everybody on the staff here could attest to that. Like, there's this heightened level of anxiety and anticipation of both Christmas Eve and Easter services because we take seriously the responsibility that is ours to, lead a different kind of worship service and kind of heighten the level of worship at a service. But it's kind of weird, isn't it? Because, like, everyone in this room is very, very aware of the fact that they're not perfect. Can we agree? And everybody in this room is very aware of the fact that their family's not perfect. And if you think that's a problem, that just means you don't have kids yet. But as soon as you have kids, you go like, it's impossible. There's no such thing as a perfect family, right? And both holidays kind of suck us into the temptation. Christmas does it in this way, or maybe your family's guilty of this. Mine isn't, well, in its own way. Okay, so here's what we do, is we go like, we got to get a picture taken, and then we got to send it to a whole bunch of people. Some people we like, and some we don't, but we're still going to send them a picture of ourselves. Right? And initially, it's this very innocent idea, like, we're going to get together, and we're going to have our picture taken, and it'll be fun. But the closer you get, and then when you actually get to the day, right, like, the pressure grows, and it goes from, like, it needs to just be a picture of all of his family to it's need to be a perfect picture. And everyone's got to be looking at the camera, and everyone's got to be smiling, and everyone's collar's got to be just perfect. And then we go from, like, we'll just set our camera out here, and we'll put the 10-second timer on it, to we'll hire a professional photographer, and it needs to be perfect, and we'll fire them if it's not. Right? And then, so we get the picture, and then we mass produce it. And then what do? We stick it in these corny envelopes. Like, who uses a gold-lined or a foil-lined envelope for any other venue in their entire life? We buy these envelopes, and we stuff them in there, and then what happens? Then we sit down and we start writing a letter. And again, initially, it's such an innocent idea. Like, we're just going to let our family know what's going on and what our kids are up to. But the more you write the letter, there's this like, oh, our family is perfect. Like, it is absolutely perfect. We have the most perfect family that the world has ever seen. Like, do you ever get one of those photos and kind of throw up in the back of your mouth, like, because they're too beautiful and it's too perfect, and there's this sense of like, what is this, an advertisement for Colgate? Like, what am I supposed to do with this thing? or the letters? Like, don't you wish just once that you got a letter that sounded something like this? Merry Christmas. I hope you had a great year. This year we didn't see my husband John very much. He worried about the company downsizing and spent the majority of his time watching sports on TV. Cody hates school. He spends every waking moment playing video games. Lucy quit playing the piano this year, is always texting her friends, and thinks we're trying to ruin her life. As for me, I'm bored with my job. I spent my days doing countless hours of washing, cooking, and cleaning, and generally felt unappreciated by my family. Happy New Year. Wouldn't that be refreshing? Because if Easter does anything, doesn't it tell us, like, God's people God's story is full of imperfect people. The way it expresses itself on Easter, I think, is we get all dressed up in our perfect clothes. Not some of you. I saw, like, flip-flops. Get dressed up in our perfect clothes, and we go to our perfect church service, which it won't be because I'm here. And then we have our perfect lunch, right? And just once we're supposed to have the perfect day. And yet again, if Easter does anything, doesn't it remind us that pressure to be perfect, it's gone. That pressure to be the perfect family, gone. Like, have you ever just stopped and considered how screwed up the families in the Bible are? Like the first family, Adam and Eve, I mean, they were at each other's throats before they got out of the honeymoon. And then they had kids. And these two kids, these two boys, they hated each other so much that it escalated to the point, not to make light of it, but like one of them murdered the other one over a sacrifice. Like imagine that, two brothers losing a relationship over spirituality. It happened then. I know it's weird. It doesn't happen anymore. Next family, Noah had a severe drinking problem. Next guy, one of the next families, Jacob and Esau, these twins. And Esau's first, which means in their culture, he gets the oldest son, the first son blessing. And while their dad is on his deathbed, Jacob decides he wants it. I mean, this is so twisted, and yet so my family and yours. Jacob decides he wants it, and so he starts like manipulating and conniving and figuring out how he can trick his dying father into giving him his blessing on his deathbed. And then his mom gets involved. Like, that's pretty imperfect. And then Jacob, he has his own family, which who would have thought, like, he came from a screwed up family, and then he had a screwed up family, and he has all these sons, and there's way too many sons. I have 3, I can't imagine 12, and 10 of them despise one of them so much so that they tie him up, throw him in a hole, and then this guy's walking by, and it's like, hey, what are you doing? I'm going to sell some slaves in Egypt. Hey, we'll sell you our brother. And they do. And then they take his clothes, they cover it with blood, and they tell their dad, hey, Dad, sorry about Joseph. He was eaten by wild animals. And then there's David. Rightly so, one of the high heroes of the Judeo-Christian faith. He one time was outside, saw a woman that he lusted after, who was happily married, mind you, had her, impregnated her, and then killed her husband as a cover-up. So there's this weird tension on the holidays where we portray ourselves as perfect, and yet God's story tells us you can't be perfect. I mean, if there's any good news in Easter, it's that Friday came. And on Friday, God's perfect Son, something we couldn't accomplish, he came, he suffered, he died. Because we can't be perfect. And he was. And in fact, some of his last words on the cross were, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I think sometimes we go like, well, yeah, that's good drama. Like, of course, Mel Gibson had to put that in there because it just feels right. What we miss is the rich theological implications of that event. In fact, theologically, what we know was going on there was called the double imputation. I know you love theology, so will you say that? Double imputation. Yeah. What that means is that in that exact moment, that wasn't drama, that in that exact moment, your sin was imputed to Christ. He was literally feeling the weight of your sin and mine in that moment. In fact, in the Jewish culture, when they still had a temple, when they would offer a sacrifice, a lamb or a goat, the family would bring that lamb, which, by the way, they would have spent a week with prior to getting to know, valuing, and then right before they slit its throat, they would all put their hand on its head and lean on the animal. And the picture, the idea, the story was very much, we need a sin bearer. Like, our sin is too much for us to bear. It has to go somewhere else. The weight of that, God, you've got to do something else. And it wasn't so much about their earning forgiveness in that moment as it was the Jewish belief that God, in fact, had to do something about their sin that they themselves couldn't do. And so as Jesus on that fateful Friday said, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was literally feeling crushed by our sin, and God literally had to turn his eyes from his son. Because the other part of the double imputation, the double piece, is that we were simultaneously imputed with his righteousness. That we don't get perfection and thus holiness and thus the opportunity to associate with a holy God because we earned it, but because Christ provided it. Easter, if it means anything, it means you can say goodbye to the pressure to be the perfect family. Now about the blazer. We take pretty seriously, as I said, our responsibility to kind of mix it up on the holidays. And so I had given the staff the assignment, like, hey, let's meet at our next leadership gathering. We're going to talk about what are we going to do for Easter. Everything from like, are we going to do like fuzzy coffee cups, or what are we going to do to kind of mix it up and heighten people's worship? So we got together, and Mike, who's the kids guy, who is very studious and very black and white and a very hard worker, he showed up with a list. I didn't know he had a list, but James knew he had a list because he was looking over his shoulder. And James said to Mikey, what's on your list? Mikey said, I was thinking that the band should all wear rabbit noses. Now, I was pretty sure he was joking. So we had this kind of like, ha, ha, ha. We kept going. Turns out none of us really had any good ideas. So Mikey took his opportunity and went like, see, I told you. The band should all wear bunny noses. It was then that I realized that he was serious. And that as idea meetings go, someone was going to have the audacity to tell him that that was a bad idea. So Lenny, in his articulate, slow-to-speak manner, said, very dry Lenny style, Mike, the nose is not the distinguishing feature of the rabbit. So the band all has cottontails on. When you see them later, you can see there. Actually, the only good idea that came was we were like, hey, let's dress up. And then we went like, hey, this whole perfection thing. So then on Monday, I went to Macy's because I didn't own a blazer. And I was looking at Macy's through the clearance rack and spent way too much time at Macy's at the clearance rack with my wife going, oh, finally found one, threw it on the counter to purchase the thing. And the most well-intentioned 70-something gal who did what most of our grandmas would do, no offense to your grandma, this is actually a compliment. I threw it on the counter. The first thing she did was identify this little tiny white speck, like right here. And she's picking at it. I'm like, oh, no. I just spent a lot of time. That's the only one here I can afford. And then she grabbed it and she went, there's like an 8-inch snag in this blazer that I just spent my morning looking at. And we just had this like moment of silence. And she was looking at my wife, and my wife's like going, don't look at me. He's the like feminine one. So and she's like, well, where did you get it? And I said, off the clearance rack. Like crying almost, she said, well, I didn't even know we had that. Like, I know, that's the whole point. What are we going to do? I don't know what we're going to do. I said, well, do you have a scissor? And so I took the thread and I cut it, and it luckily, like, it was like something from the lining, and then the piece fell back in, and there's no snag. And she said, then I'll give you 10% more off. And I was like, sweet. So there you have it. If you've not been with us the last few weeks, we've been working through a series called Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And this series has been inspired by this observation that Jesus' death was the most influential death in human history. That when you look at the Gospels, some would call them biographies, probably not the best term, but for the sake of this, it's the term we've been using. What you realize is that 1/3 of the material about Jesus in those 4 Gospels deals with his death, and particularly the 3 days surrounding his death. And so we've just been dealing real thoroughly with each of those 3 days. And these paintings were done for each of the 3 days. So on Friday, Jesus' great courage led to his being arrested. On Friday, Jesus' great heart led him to being crucified on the cross. On Friday, that which looked like the most horrible event in human history turned out to be the greatest act of self-sacrificial love the world had ever seen. Friday was the darkest day in human history, and yet we call it Good Friday because we benefited. On Saturday's in the story even though there's only 2 events, because Saturday's in all of our stories. It's the day in between the prayer prayed and the prayer answered. It's the day in between the God, why, and because Saturday's about silence. On Saturday, the disciples, the original followers of Jesus, were stuck, not knowing that Sunday was coming. On Saturday, the anger of Friday was coupled with the anger that comes from the silence of God on Saturday. On Saturday, Jesus entered into death for you and for me. Entered into hell for you and for me. On Sunday, a stone was rolled away. Death was defeated. On Sunday, the grave lost its sting. On Sunday, you got something to live for, and you got something to hope for beyond your death. On Sunday, Satan was defeated. On Sunday, God's plan to bring a Savior to replace that lamb and goat was replaced. Sunday is therefore the central proclamation of the greatest victory over the darkest of enemies, of the most noble of heroes the world has ever seen. I mean, you could say it this way: if ever there was something to be celebrated, it is this, that Jesus Christ is risen. Now, we're a new church, and lots of us, this is our first church experience in a long time, and there's a piece of church history that myself included has been lost along the way that I think is worth holding on to. It's this: for hundreds, maybe thousands, it's unclear, of years, when the church gathered to celebrate the resurrection, there's been this customary greeting. It goes like this: Jesus Christ is risen. And the response is, yeah, so let's do this again. If ever there was something worthy of being celebrated, it is this: Jesus Christ is risen. Yeah. So what I want to do, we're going to do this with our time remaining. Well, we're going to do some other things too, but I want to enter into Easter and experience it the way the first disciples did. It's kind of what we've done throughout this series is to go, what was Friday like? What was Saturday like? Now, what was Sunday like for the original followers of Jesus? Not just the 12 dudes, but including the women, the crew of people who watched his death and then dealt with the suffering of Saturday. What was Sunday like for them? What was Easter like for them? And to do that, Matthew actually helps us quite a bit to get inside that conversation. In Matthew, he offers some hints, if you will, of what Easter was like for them. It starts this way: after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at a tomb. At the tomb, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Now, with all due respect, could we just agree that Jesus was a little understated in his greeting? Greetings. I mean, like these poor gals, right? Like they experienced Friday. They watched their rabbi, this man that they hoped was their Messiah, this guy who offered all this hope in this crazy movement. They watched him suffer on Friday, and on Saturday they endured the silence. And finally they get to meet this man that they love, and there's this like, what profound thing will he say to them? And he says, "Greetings." I mean, come on, really? Like, you're God. You got to do better than greetings. And in fact, when you do a word study, what you find is that it was just a very typical first century greeting. It was like saying, "Hey, how's it going? What'd you expect? Dude, if you hang out with Lenny, word." I mean, it's just this very simple, very bland, very straightforward greeting. There's a well-known New Testament scholar who is purported to have been teaching a preschool class on Easter morning, and he was reading this very passage, and he stopped before the greetings, and he said to the class, "So what do you think Jesus said to the women when he first appeared?" This little girl was going crazy, of course, and he calls on her and he said, what did he say? And she said, "Ta-da!" Ta-da! Would have been better, right? Ta-da! Okay, so just to catch the hint. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid. Watch that. I mean, it's so counterintuitive. They hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." See, the reality is, everything was different after Easter, wasn't it? Like, nothing was the same. And yet I wonder if it didn't change, if it didn't mean something different to them than our culture typically embraces. Because hasn't Easter in our culture become this empty metaphor that means spring is coming, the flowers are blooming, life is eternal, and everything's going to be okay in the end? And wouldn't our friends who are skeptical about Jesus and even more skeptical about the resurrection, wouldn't they push back and go, this is just another instance of well-intentioned people not being able to embrace the realities of life and death? Like, hasn't it all too often the resurrection came to be this kind of fairy tale story where all the tension of Friday, all the frustration of Saturday, like any good movie, has a really good, soft ending, where everything's okay, everyone's happy, and everyone goes off to live happily ever after? And in fact, when you get inside the story, that's about 180 degrees opposite of what Easter meant to the first disciples. One of the remarkable things about the gospel accounts is when you read them, and this didn't, someone had to point this out to me this year as I was studying for this series. But as you read the gospel accounts, one of the shocking things is every time someone encountered the resurrected Christ, they left that encounter more afraid than they were before the encounter. I just really botched that sentence. They left the encounter more frightened than they were prior to meeting the resurrected Christ. We see it among the two Marys. They left afraid, yet filled with joy. In the Gospel of Mark, Here's verse 8, which some scholars would say was most likely the last verse of the Gospel of Mark. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And in fact, if you read just about any Bible that you can name, if you open the Gospel of Mark, there'll be a footnote by verse 8 that'll say, most scholars agree that the Gospel actually ended here, and there's another paragraph that follows, but the oldest manuscripts we have of the Gospel, they stop at verse 8. It's like the early church struggled with the same thing you and I struggle with, the tension of, wait a minute, it's supposed to be this nice metaphor. But the original disciples, they left afraid. In the Gospel of John, every time you find, I keep saying every time, which is probably too black and white, but you keep finding the disciples in the Gospel of John, after they've met with the resurrected Christ, you keep finding them behind closed doors, meeting and afraid. And there's this question of like, wait a minute, what is going on here? What is going on that this Messiah comes and he meets people and they're more terrified after the interaction than they were before? Which requires us to go back into the history. Remember, it's Sunday morning. Friday night was just the day before yesterday. On Friday, Jesus the Messiah was crucified. On Friday, this wannabe, so they believed, Messiah was found out, rooted out, and killed. And the disciples knew all too well that what followed a Messiah's being killed was his disciples are killed. The reason the disciples ran away in fear when he was arrested, the reason why Peter was covertly watching the trials, didn't have everything to do with the fact that he was a coward. It had much more to do with the fact that he was an enemy of the state too. And the Romans, they killed a Messiah and then they kill his disciples. And now get in the history of it. So you're a disciple. The Messiah has been killed. You're afraid for your life. And then he shows up, and what does he say to them? I'll tell you what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, hey, everything's going to be okay. He doesn't say, hey, life is eternal, so just go live your life and you'll have heaven when you die. He doesn't say, whew, sure glad that's over. He doesn't say, let's all go to heaven and have a big party. What does he say? He says, the cross didn't stick. My movement isn't over. They tried to take me out. They tried to kill me. It didn't work. In fact, God has vindicated everything I've taught. Everything I've taught about love and sacrifice, God has vindicated it. I am back from the dead. And then what's he say? So guys, I'm leaving, heading up there. And I'm going to send my spirit. And then what follows? Now you go tell them. What do you get to tell them? Oh, you get to tell them they were wrong. You get to tell them they tried to kill the Messiah, but he's still alive. You get to tell them that his ways are the right ways. Like, they hated me, they killed me. Now you go tell them the movement's not over. Jesus is alive. No wonder they were afraid. Because on Sunday, their lives didn't get more safe. Their lives got a whole lot more dangerous. On Sunday, they didn't get this nice, safe plan for a really easy existence. On Sunday, they were given an assignment, and that assignment was dangerous. Go tell the world, I am who I said I am. Go tell those Romans that their plan didn't stick. On Sunday, they were afraid, and yet they also had discovered something that was stronger than fear. Relationship with the resurrected Messiah. Ever heard of Larry Walters? Some of you that are products of the 70s and 80s, Larry Walters, and he was a man who desired to be in aviation. His eyesight didn't allow it, and in 1982, having established himself as a truck driver, he was in an Army-Navy surplus store when he saw some weather balloons. Spent his whole life desiring to fly, saw these weather balloons, didn't think much of it, went home and had a bit of an epiphany. Went back to the Army-Navy store. This is a true story. Went back to the Army-Navy store. He lived near Long Beach in California. Bought 45 weather balloons. Enough helium to fill all of them. Called his friends. They met him at his house. He took a lawn chair, kind of roped it to the ground. Took these 45 weather balloons, filled them with helium, tied them to the lawn chair. You can see the picture. He also included in the lawn chair, because see, his plan was to just float about 30 feet off the ground, hang out for a while, and then he would take his pellet gun that he was bringing along with him, and he would shoot a few balloons, and he would float back to the ground. While he was up there, he planned to eat his sandwiches, drink his 6-pack of beer, which were also attached to the launcher. I mean, you might be a redneck if you do this, but I'm not sure. So he did it, got situated, told his buddies, cut the rope. They cut the rope. But have you noticed when you let go of a balloon, it doesn't gently float out of your hand? Nor did his. It shot like a rocket. It didn't stop at 30 feet. It didn't stop at 1,000 feet. It didn't stop at 10,000 feet. It finally came to a rest at 15,000 feet above, the metropolis that is California. Then the air currents took over and he started to drift. It was then that he was greeted by a large passenger jet that was approaching for landing at the local Long Beach airport. Right? Like some of you are going, like, every time I think of this story, I go, like, there are people at Narrate that are going to try this now. Or you're going, like, dang, they took my idea. He had a CB radio, too, and someone radioed him, and they're like, hey, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, I'm okay, but I'm petrified, and I didn't bring any kind of, anyway. And so then he took his gun, and he finally had to break down, and he shot a few balloons. He was going to shoot a few more, but then he dropped his pellet gun from 15,000 feet. And so he just kind of had to hang out as he floated down to the ground. Didn't quite reach the ground. He reached the power lines before he reached the ground, got all tangled up in the power lines. When he finally got down, he was greeted by officers of the law, of course. All kinds of offenses had been made. As they were taking him in handcuffs to the car, a reporter put a microphone in front of his face and said, why'd you do it? His response, a man can't just sit around. Because a man can't just sit around. What if Sunday is about way more than just sitting around? What if being the church is about way more than sitting around? See, on Sunday, the disciples got an assignment, and it was a scary assignment, and yet the assignment was bigger than the fear. I'm not a big fan of, I have an aversion for messages like go die for Jesus, not because I don't think we're supposed to be willing, but because I don't find it all that relevant in our culture. But just listen to the lives of the disciples, or rather to the deaths of the disciples. Simon Peter was tortured at Mamertine in Rome for 9 months, crucified upside down in 69. Andrew was scourged and tied to a cross in 69. James, son of Zebedee, was beheaded by the sword in Jerusalem. John was banished to the island of Patmos, but not until he was boiled in oil and survived that, and so he kind of freaked out the authorities. Philip was crucified and stoned in AD 53. Bartholomew was beaten with clubs, flayed alive, and crucified in 68. I don't even know how that's just gross. Thomas was killed with a spear. Matthew, we don't know. James, son of Alphaeus, was stoned to death in Jerusalem during the reign of Justinian. Jude Thaddeus was killed by a javelin. Simon the Canaanite was crucified. And Matthias, the one who replaced Judas Iscariot, was stoned to death in AD 64. On Easter, on Sunday, the disciples' lives got a whole lot more dangerous because they were given an assignment. What if it's not about easy? What if it's not about safe? What if it's about purpose? Because when you think about it, God has always been a sending God, hasn't he? He sent Abraham to a foreign land. He sent Moses to Egypt. He sent Joseph to Egypt. He sent the prophets to Israel. He sent John the Baptist to the countryside. He sent Jesus to the world. He sent the disciples to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Who are we to think that he's done sending in about AD 33? I think the question that it raises is where's God sending you? Where's he sending you? And I don't have this desire to kind of tell you where he's sending you, but where's he sending you? Who are those people at work? Who are those people in your neighborhood? Who are those people, God nudges you? What are those needs God nudges you? And I think it's at this juncture, see, we can all get warm and fuzzy and think the goal is, I can identify a need. And it's there that we have to remind ourselves that Jesus himself told a story about someone who said they would do it and didn't, and someone who said they wouldn't do it and did. It's the guy who under-promised and over-delivered that Jesus says, he's on my team. Where's he sending you? How is he calling you to matter? Is Christianity about arriving at death safely, or is it about purpose? Is it about mattering? Do we as a church, do we host dodgeball tournaments and Ales for Trails events and split firewood for the city and the pine beetle problem as well as the working poor? Do we serve myriad friends of friends in myriad ways? Do we do that because it's cool, because we think we can earn our salvation, because we think there's pressure on us to be perfect? Or do we do that because we follow a sending God who on Sunday said, they killed me. Now go tell them I'm alive. Do we follow a Jesus who on Sunday said, hey, go matter. And we live in a culture, I would argue, that is so averse to hearing about Jesus, and there's been so many bad examples of well-intentioned Christians cramming it down coworkers' mouths and whatever, and justifying that in the name of you-know-what, or whatever, that we think like, well, you got to put a towel over your arm and serve before you can even earn the right to have that conversation. Maybe you're someone, maybe you've never before embraced that Jesus is who he said that he is. And I would suggest that Easter would be a great time to do that. And to do so is to believe in Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in the implications of a calling. Let me pray. You can just take a moment and wrestle with what you're thinking about, and I'll close this up. God, I pray for friends here who have not met you and are meeting you or have a desire to do so. You give them the courage to tell someone about that and get some help. I pray for those of us that are, we've celebrated lots of Easters and been believers over lots of Easters, and there's a numbness that sets in. God, we want to follow you. We want to serve you. We love you. Amen.